Objection, Miss Bondi. Approach the bench, now. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. In a packed federal courtroom, every whisper stopped. Pens froze mid-sentence. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed louder than usual. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, a seasoned attorney and former Florida Attorney General known for her confidence, precision, and commanding courtroom presence. But on this day, something was different. The trial had already been intense. For nearly 2 weeks, the courtroom had been a stage for complicated financial records, tense witness testimonies, and carefully crafted arguments. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters filled the back rows, ready to document every raised eyebrow and sharpened tone. Legal analysts sat quietly, studying every exchange like a chess match unfolding in real time. The case itself was high stakes. Allegations of financial misconduct involving powerful business figures whose reputations and futures hung in the balance. Millions of dollars were in question. Careers were at risk. And for the 12 jurors seated just feet away, the responsibility was enormous. They had been listening carefully for days, watching, measuring, absorbing not just the words spoken, but the way they were delivered. And then came the moment that changed the tone of the entire trial. Bondi had just finished a forceful line of questioning during cross-examination. She stood confidently at the podium, one hand resting lightly on a stack of documents, the other gesturing with controlled emphasis. Her voice was sharp, deliberate, unwavering. Each question was designed to chip away at the credibility of the prosecution's key witness, a former executive who had agreed to testify after striking a cooperation deal. She pressed him about timelines, about emails, about signatures on financial approvals. The witness shifted in his seat. His answers grew shorter. The tension began to rise. Then Bondi leaned slightly forward and delivered a pointed question, one that carried more weight than the others. Isn't it true that your story only changed after you secured immunity for yourself? The prosecution shot up instantly. Objection! The word echoed. Argumentative, the prosecutor added firmly. For a split second, everything paused. The jury's eyes moved from the prosecutor to Bondi. She didn't back down. Instead, she rephrased, or at least attempted to. Let me ask it this way, she continued, her tone firm. You only began cooperating once your own legal exposure was reduced, correct? The courtroom felt tighter, smaller. The witness hesitated before answering. That hesitation may have lasted only 2 seconds, but in a courtroom, 2 seconds can feel like 2 minutes. And that's when the judge intervened. Not casually, not with mild correction, but decisively. Ms. Bondi, the judge said, his voice steady but unmistakably stern. Approach the bench. Now. A ripple of energy moved through the room. Bondi walked toward the bench, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The prosecution joined her. Their conversation was hushed, shielded from the jury by a white noise machine. But the body language spoke volumes. The judge leaned forward. Bondi listened. At one point, she nodded slightly, though her posture remained firm. Back in the jury box, expressions were frozen somewhere between curiosity and concern. One juror adjusted their glasses and stopped writing altogether. Another folded their hands and stared straight ahead, as if unsure whether to react. Moments later, Bondi returned to her podium. The judge addressed the courtroom. The jury will disregard the last question, he instructed clearly. Counsel will confine her questions to matters directly related to the evidence presented. It wasn't a shouting reprimand, but it was unmistakably a warning. And in a courtroom, tone matters as much as volume. The message was clear. Boundaries had been approached, perhaps crossed. When questioning resumed, Bondi's delivery had changed. The edge in her voice had softened slightly. Her pacing slowed. Instead of pressing aggressively, she chose her words more carefully, anchoring each question tightly to documented exhibits. The witness seemed to regain composure, but the atmosphere had shifted. The earlier rhythm of confrontation had been interrupted. Now, every word felt heavier, measured. Even the jurors appeared more alert, not just to the witness's answers, but to the dynamic between the attorneys and the bench. They weren't just evaluating facts anymore. They were observing control, credibility, professionalism. Because in trials like this, perception can shape persuasion, and perception had just been tested. As the afternoon light filtered faintly through the high courtroom windows, the tension never fully disappeared. It lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable. What had begun as a routine cross-examination had turned into a defining moment. A reminder that even the most experienced attorneys operate within strict lines, and that in a courtroom, Authority ultimately belongs to the judge. For the jury, the interruption may have lasted only minutes, but its impact? That would last much longer. The question that sparked it all. To truly understand the tension that filled the courtroom, we have to rewind just a few minutes, back to the exact exchange that lit the fuse. Pam Bondi stood tall at the defense table, her posture steady, her expression focused. She had built her reputation on sharp cross-examinations and calculated pressure. This was not unfamiliar territory for her. If anything, it was where she thrived. Across from her sat the prosecution's key witness, a former executive who had once worked closely with the defendants. Earlier in the trial, he had admitted to approving several questionable financial transactions. Emails with his signature had been displayed on large monitors. Bank records had been read aloud. Dates, amounts, internal memos, all carefully laid out for the jury. But here's what made his testimony powerful. He had turned against the very people he once stood beside. He had agreed to cooperate. And cooperation, in a federal case, often comes with conditions. Bondi knew that. The jury knew that. And she intended to make sure they never forgot it. Her strategy was simple but effective. Don't attack the facts directly. Attack the credibility of the person presenting them. She began calmly. You were present at the March 12th meeting, correct? Yes. And you signed off on the transfer the following day? Yes. Her tone was controlled, neutral, almost conversational, but slowly she began tightening the screws. You didn't raise any concerns at the time, did you? No. You didn't report anything to authorities in 2021? No. Each answer landed like a stepping stone toward something bigger. The jury followed closely. Some nodded subtly, others scribbled notes. Then Bondi paused. She glanced briefly at her notes, though it seemed more deliberate than necessary, and looked directly at the witness. That's when she asked the question that shifted the air in the room. Isn't it true that you only began cooperating after securing immunity for yourself? The words themselves were sharp, but it wasn't just the wording, it was the tone. Direct, accusatory, implying motive. The prosecution shot up instantly. Objection! The sudden movement startled more than a few people in the gallery. Argumentative, the prosecutor added, voice firm and unwavering. There was a brief silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to make everyone aware something serious is unfolding. Bondi didn't retreat. Instead, she adjusted her phrasing, her eyes never leaving the witness. Let me rephrase, she said evenly. You entered into a cooperation agreement before providing this testimony, correct? The witness hesitated, only slightly. Yes. And that agreement reduced your potential criminal exposure? Another pause. Yes. The prosecution objected again, this time more urgently. Your Honor. That's when the judge leaned forward. He removed his glasses slowly, placing them carefully on the bench. It was a small gesture, but in a courtroom, small gestures can carry enormous weight. His gaze fixed on Bondi. Ms. Bondi, he began, his voice measured but unmistakably stern. You will confine your questions to the scope permitted. The courtroom felt frozen. Then came the line that sealed the moment. You are not here to testify. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The authority behind it was enough. No one gasped audibly, but you could feel the reaction ripple through the room. Shoulders stiffened. A reporter in the back lowered their pen mid-sentence. One juror stopped writing entirely and simply stared forward. Because this wasn't just a procedural correction. This was a public reminder of boundaries. In trials, attorneys walk a fine line. They can challenge, they can press, they can suggest inconsistencies. But they cannot inject personal commentary or imply facts not properly entered into evidence. The judge's message was clear. That line had been approached, perhaps crossed. For a brief moment, Bondi stood still. Her expression didn't dramatically change, but the atmosphere around her did. The momentum she had built during cross-examination suddenly met resistance. Control, which moments earlier seemed firmly in her grasp, had shifted. The prosecution sat down slowly, satisfied. The witness exhaled almost imperceptibly. And the jury? They were watching everything. Not just the witness, not just the facts, but the power dynamic. Who was pushing too hard? Who was being reined in? Who appeared steady under pressure? Because trials aren't just about documents and testimony, they're about perception. Jurors evaluate credibility in real time. They notice tone, body language, confidence, restraint. And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just debating immunity agreements. It was witnessing a recalibration of authority. When Bondi resumed questioning, her delivery was more measured. The sharp edge had softened slightly. Each question was shorter, more technical, tethered closely to exhibits already admitted into evidence. But the earlier exchange lingered in the air like static electricity. The tension had never been solely about legal rules. It was about control. And in that pivotal moment, when the judge removed his glasses and issued that warning, control visibly shifted. What the jury would ultimately do with that moment remained unknown, but no one in that courtroom would forget it. A battle of authority. Courtrooms operate on respect and order. Every movement, every question, every objection follows a structure built over centuries of legal tradition. Attorneys are expected to argue passionately, even aggressively at times, but always within strict boundaries. The rules are not suggestions. They are the framework that keeps justice balanced. And inside that framework, there is one undeniable reality. The judge holds ultimate authority. Pam Bondi knew this better than most. With years of courtroom experience and a national profile as a former Florida Attorney General, she was no stranger to high-pressure legal battles. She had faced hostile witnesses, skeptical judges, and relentless opposing counsel before. Confrontation did not intimidate her. It energized her. But this moment was different. After sustaining the prosecution's objection, the judge didn't simply move on. He called Bondi to the bench. Approach. The word was calm, but it carried weight. Bondi walked forward, posture straight, expression composed. The prosecution joined her. A white noise machine hummed to prevent the jury from overhearing the conversation. From the gallery, observers could only see body language, but sometimes that tells the entire story. The judge leaned slightly forward. Bondi listened. At one point, she responded, measured, controlled, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the bench. The exchange wasn't theatrical. There were no raised voices. But those sitting close enough to observe described it later as measured but heated. It was the kind of professional tension that doesn't need volume to feel intense. The judge appeared firm, unyielding. Bondi appeared resolute but aware. This wasn't just a discussion about one question. It was about boundaries, about tone, about influence in front of a jury. After nearly 2 minutes, they stepped back. Bondi returned to her podium. The prosecution settled into their seats. The judge adjusted his microphone and turned his attention directly to the 12 people who mattered most in that room. Members of the jury, he began, voice steady and deliberate. You will disregard the last statement. It is not evidence. The words were simple, but they carried enormous weight. In trials, when jurors are instructed to disregard something, it creates a paradox. They are told to forget, yet the very act of being told makes the moment stand out even more. It becomes highlighted in memory. And that's what made this exchange so powerful. For several seconds after the instruction, no one moved. The courtroom felt suspended in time. A juror in the second row slowly set down their pen. Another shifted in their seat, eyes moving briefly from the judge to Bondi, then back again. A third juror folded their hands together, expression unreadable. They weren't just absorbing information, they were evaluating credibility. Authority had just been asserted, clearly and publicly. When Bondi resumed questioning, the difference was subtle but unmistakable. Her voice, once edged with sharp emphasis, was calmer. Her pacing slowed. Instead of leaning forward with pointed intensity, she stood more upright, her tone measured and deliberate. Each question was carefully anchored to admitted evidence, each sentence shorter, cleaner. The earlier aggression had softened, not vanished, but recalibrated. And the jury noticed. Jurors are trained, during orientation, to evaluate not just facts, but demeanor. They are instructed to consider how witnesses behave, how attorneys present themselves, how objections are handled. Everything in that room contributes to the larger picture forming in their minds. Moments like this can shift perception. Not dramatically, not instantly, but subtly. Bondi's strength had always been her assertiveness, her ability to press until cracks appeared. But after the judge's public instruction, pressing too hard carried risk. The courtroom dynamic had changed. The boundaries were now visible, clearly marked. The prosecution, sensing the shift, appeared more confident. They objected less frequently, perhaps knowing the judge had already drawn a line. The witness, who moments earlier had seemed cornered, regained some composure. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His answers came more steadily. Authority had been clarified. Inside a courtroom, that matters deeply. Judges are more than referees. They are guardians of procedure, protectors of fairness. When they step in decisively, it signals to everyone, attorneys, witnesses, jurors, that balance must be maintained. And balance had just been restored. But restoration doesn't erase impact. If anything, it amplifies awareness. From that point forward, every question Bondi asked carried an added layer of scrutiny, not just from the prosecution, but from the jury itself. The unspoken question lingered. Would she push that line again? She didn't. Instead, she adjusted, adapted, focused tightly on documents and timelines. Professional, controlled, strategic. Yet the memory of that exchange hung quietly in the air, a reminder that even seasoned litigators must answer to the authority of the bench. In that battle of authority, there was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, but there was a clear signal. And in a courtroom, signals can shape everything. For the jury, it was a moment that revealed the invisible structure of power inside the trial. Who sets limits, who challenges them, and who ultimately enforces them. The case would continue. Witnesses would testify. Arguments would be made. But for those who sat in that room that day, one thing was certain. They had witnessed more than a legal objection. They had witnessed a recalibration of control. The jury's reaction. The jury is the silent audience that matters most. They don't interrupt. They don't argue. They don't object. They watch. Every movement, every pause, every change in tone. Inside that courtroom, while attorneys battled with words and the judge enforced the rules, the 12 jurors sat just a few feet away, absorbing it all. And when the judge publicly corrected Pam Bondi, it wasn't just a procedural adjustment. It was a signal, a subtle but powerful shift in the dynamic of the room. Some jurors leaned back in their chairs, their pens hovering above notepads. Others folded their arms, a small gesture, but one that can signal skepticism or reevaluation. One juror reportedly glanced repeatedly at the judge after the exchange, as if silently recalibrating how to interpret what had just happened. Because jurors don't just evaluate evidence, they evaluate credibility. They ask themselves silent questions. Who seems composed? Who seems defensive? Who appears confident? And who appears controlled? When the judge instructed them to disregard the last statement, their role became even more delicate. They were told to ignore a question that had just raised a serious implication about the witness's motive. But human psychology doesn't work like a light switch. You can't simply unhear something. If anything, the instruction may have made that question echo louder in their minds. And that's where perception enters the equation. Trials are not just legal contests. They are human dramas. The jury is tasked with interpreting not only facts, but behavior. They notice whether a witness hesitates, whether an attorney presses too hard, whether a correction from the bench feels routine or pointed. In that moment, the correction didn't feel routine. It felt firm, deliberate, and visible. Confidence in the courtroom can be persuasive. A strong, assertive attorney can inspire belief in their argument. But there is a fine line between confidence and overreach. Cross it, even slightly, and confidence can start to look like aggression. Some legal analysts later debated what the jury might have taken from the exchange. One school of thought argued that Bondi's aggressive questioning accomplished its goal. By spotlighting the witness's immunity agreement, even briefly, she may have planted seeds of doubt. The jurors now clearly understood that the witness had something to gain from cooperating. That doubt, once introduced, can linger. Another perspective suggested the opposite. The public correction, delivered clearly and directly by the judge, may have subtly framed Bondi as pushing beyond proper limits. In a courtroom, respect for rules matters deeply. If jurors perceive an attorney as stepping outside those boundaries, it can impact how they weigh that attorney's arguments going forward. Neither interpretation can be measured in real time. But what is undeniable is this. The energy shifted. Before the exchange, the courtroom atmosphere had been charged, intense but flowing. Questions came quickly. Answers followed. Objections were brief interruptions in an otherwise steady rhythm. Afterward, the rhythm changed. It became slower, more deliberate, measured. The jurors' faces reflected that shift. They appeared more alert, not in a dramatic way, but in a heightened, focused manner. Each new question from Bondi seemed to be evaluated more carefully. Each answer from the witness seemed to carry additional weight. It was as if everyone in the room had collectively become more cautious. The prosecution, sensing the moment, maintained a steadier posture. They objected less frequently, perhaps confident that the judge's earlier intervention had drawn a visible boundary. The witness, who had seemed momentarily pressured, now answered in a more controlled tone. His pauses were shorter, his posture steadier. And Bondi? She adjusted. Her delivery became more precise. She relied heavily on documents and timelines rather than pointed implications. The sharp edge that had defined her earlier questioning softened into a more strategic, restrained approach. The jury noticed that too. Because jurors are highly attuned to change, when behavior shifts after a judicial correction, it reinforces the significance of that correction. It signals that something important happened, something worth remembering. From that point on, the courtroom felt different. Not hostile, not chaotic, but cautious, as if everyone was walking on thin ice. Every word seemed chosen with extra care. Every objection felt heavier. Even the pauses between questions stretched slightly longer than before. The unspoken understanding was clear. Boundaries had been tested once. They would not be tested again. For the jury, the moment likely became part of the larger narrative forming in their minds. Trials are stories, complex ones, and jurors piece them together bit by bit. That exchange became a chapter in that story. A chapter about authority, about credibility, about limits. Whether it ultimately helped or hurt the defense would depend on how the rest of the trial unfolded, on closing arguments, on additional witnesses, on the totality of evidence presented. But in that specific moment, something intangible shifted. The courtroom grew quieter. The stakes felt heavier. And every person in that jury box understood one thing. They weren't just watching a legal case. They were witnessing a delicate balance of power, and how quickly it can change. The aftermath and what it means. When the court recessed that afternoon, the tension didn't simply disappear. It followed everyone out the door. Reporters hurried down the courthouse steps, phones already pressed to their ears. Producers texted for updates. Legal analysts began crafting instant reactions. And before the day was over, headlines were circulating, all centered on one moment: the judge publicly calling out Pam Bondi mid-trial. In the world of high-profile litigation, exchanges like that travel fast. But here's what makes moments like this so powerful. Trials aren't just about facts. They're about trust. The jury must trust the evidence. They must trust the witnesses. And yes, they must trust the attorneys standing before them. When a judge publicly corrects a lawyer, even in a measured and professional way, it subtly reshapes that trust dynamic. It doesn't shout guilt or innocence. It doesn't decide the outcome. But it does introduce a new layer of perception. Because jurors are human, and humans interpret signals. A judicial correction can signal fairness, that the court is actively protecting boundaries. It can reinforce the idea that the system is working exactly as it should. But it can also create questions in the minds of jurors. Was the attorney pushing too far? Was that question inappropriate? Should we be cautious about how we interpret the defense's strategy? None of those questions are spoken aloud, but they exist quietly beneath the surface. That doesn't mean the case was decided in that instant. Far from it. Verdicts are built on days, sometimes weeks, of testimony, documents, cross-examinations, and closing arguments. Jurors are instructed to consider the totality of evidence, not isolated moments. Still, dramatic courtroom exchanges leave emotional impressions. And emotional impressions matter. For Bondi, the moment served as a sharp reminder that even the most experienced legal minds must operate within strict boundaries. Experience brings confidence, but confidence must always be balanced with precision. The courtroom is not a debate stage. It is a structured environment, governed by rules that exist to protect fairness on both sides. For the jury, the exchange was something even more significant. A glimpse behind the curtain. They saw firsthand how authority works inside that room. They saw that the judge was willing to step in, decisively, to enforce limits. They saw that even a nationally recognized legal figure is not above procedural correction. And that reinforces something essential. The courtroom is not theater. It may feel dramatic at times. Voices may rise. Stakes may feel enormous. But it is not performance. It is process. Structured, deliberate, controlled. For those watching from outside, the public following updates, the commentators analyzing strategy, the moment carried its own symbolism. It was proof that even powerful figures can be challenged instantly and publicly when lines are crossed. No special treatment, no quiet sidestepping, just a firm reminder of boundaries. As the trial continued in the days that followed, the exchange lingered like a faint echo. Bondi's approach appeared more measured. The prosecution remained vigilant. The judge maintained steady oversight. But observers couldn't help wondering, would the jury remember that warning during deliberations? Would it influence how they weighed the witness's testimony? Would they interpret Bondi's earlier aggression as strategic advocacy or as overreach? Or would it ultimately fade into the background, overshadowed by financial records, timelines, and closing arguments? Trials are layered narratives. Jurors don't base decisions on a single moment. They build a mosaic, piece by piece, until a full picture forms. That exchange became one of those pieces. Not the entire picture, but a tile in the mosaic. And sometimes, small tiles influence how the entire image is seen. Legal analysts often say that courtroom credibility is cumulative. It grows, or shrinks, over time. A correction from the bench doesn't destroy credibility, but it adds complexity to it. For Bondi, the incident may have reinforced her image as a fierce advocate willing to push hard for her client. For others, it may have served as a cautionary note about the limits of courtroom persuasion. Ultimately, only the final verdict would reveal whether the moment carried lasting weight. But one thing is certain. For a brief, unforgettable stretch of seconds, time seemed to stop in that courtroom. The air tightened. Pens paused. Eyes shifted. Authority was asserted. And everyone inside that room, from the attorneys to the jurors to the reporters in the back row, felt the shift. Because sometimes, in the middle of a long and complex trial, a single exchange can crystallize the stakes. It can remind everyone watching that justice is not just about arguments. It's about balance, about boundaries, about trust. And in that fleeting but powerful moment, all of those forces collided, leaving an impression that would outlast the day itself. If you enjoyed this courtroom story and want more real-life moments of tension, power, and unforgettable responses, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story.